Hello and welcome again to episode 5, I believe, of our Shuriman series here on League, Lore, and More. Today we are going to be discussing the Curator of the Sands, Nasus' brother to the Butcher of the Sands that we talked about last week in Renekton. We also talked a lot about Nasus last week, given that he's the brother of Renekton and that their stories are one and the same in a sense. They share this journey. And so today we'll be going through his biography, a story about him and what happens to him post the fall of Shuriman after the failed ascension of Azir at the hands of Xerath. And it's all kind of tying together here, and so it's going to be a little weird maybe in a few weeks when we have maybe a story that and a character that doesn't quite fit in with this entire epic poem that we have going with the Shuriman storylines of all these characters. But before we get to that, just another thank you to everyone that listens and any new listeners. I really appreciate it. It really helps get more people noticing it, and I will save all of my other self-promotion for the end of my podcast now. But so yeah, without further ado, we will get to the story of Nasus, and first up will be his biography that is found, like always, on the Universe website, universe.leagueoflegends.com, where you can find all of these and as well as the stories. So I guess we also need to give a big thanks to Riot Games, since this is their IP, their creation that we use, and we try to put our own spin on things, and maybe in the future we'll be writing our own, but until then we are thankful for them, and hopefully we aren't infringing on anything. But yeah, enjoy the story of Nasus.
The cycle of life and death continues. We will live, they will die.
Before we get into the biography, that I just want to mention that quote from Nasus that you just heard is probably at least my favorite quote from a champion in the entire game. I think it gets played when you pick Nasus in Champion Select or you ban him, one of the two. But yeah, it's just, I don't know, I love his voice. It's so deep, and I've just always liked it. And yeah, that's all I have to say about it. But I just thought I would mention that. But now we can get into the biography for Nasus, or as people who know the game well call him Susan. Nasus backwards is Susan, or the dog, because he takes the form of the jackal and he looks dog-like. But anyway, here is his biography, which is going to have a lot of similar things to what we learned last week with Renekton, but let's just kind of tie it all in together. Nasus' brilliance was recognized long before he was chosen to join the ranks of the Ascended. A voracious student, he memorized and critiqued the greatest works of Shuriman history and philosophy before he was 10. However, his passion was not shared by his younger brother Renekton, who tended to bore quickly and fight with other local children instead. Nonetheless, the brothers were close, and Nasus kept an eye on Renekton, ensuring he didn't get into too much trouble. When he came of age, Nasus was welcomed into the prestigious and exclusive Collegium of the Sun. He had the best teachers in the Empire and developed a keen understanding of military strategy and logistics, eventually becoming the youngest general in history. While a competent soldier, his genius lay not in fighting battles, but in planning them. A deeply empathetic man, Nasus took his responsibilities seriously, always ensuring his soldiers were well provisioned, paid on time, and treated fairly. He guided the Emperor's mortal armies to countless victories, and was respected by all who served beneath him. Sure enough, his brother Renekton also entered military service, and rose through the ranks as a trusted and capable warrior under Nasus' command. But despite his triumphs and accolades, Nasus did not enjoy war. He understood its importance, for now at least, in the Empire's rapid expansion, yet firmly believed his greatest contribution to Shuriman was the knowledge they could gather and preserve in the wake of each conquest. At his urging, all the books, scrolls, and teachings of the cultures they defeated were added to libraries and repositories throughout the Empire to bring wisdom and enlightenment to generations still to come. After decades of dutiful service, Nasus was cruelly struck by a terrible wasting sickness, and his physicians solemnly declared that the general would be dead within a week. I'm going to stop here and we heard this last time with Renekton's, that it was this wasting sickness, and I like that they included this in his lore because Nasus has one of his abilities in the game is called Wither, so withering away. So it's an effect that he can put on to an enemy character, and I just thought that it's a neat connection between the game and the lore of the actual champion. Anyway, the people of Shurima were bereft, for Nasus was their brightest star and beloved by all. The Emperor himself pleaded with Sataka of the Ascended Host for the great man's deeds to be weighed before the sun disk. After a day and night, Sataka's emissaries confirmed that Nasus would be blessed with Ascension. He would have to undergo the rituals at once, despite his infirmity. Renekton, now a war leader in his own right, raced home to be with his brother. He was shocked to find Nasus's flesh wasted away, his bones fragile as glass. So weak was he that as Sundisk's golden radiance streamed over the dais, Nasus was unable to climb the final steps into his light. Renekton's love for his brother was stronger than any sense of self-preservation. He carried the weakly protesting Nasus onto the dais and would willingly accept oblivion. However, Renekton was not destroyed as expected, and as we learned last week, when the light faded, not one but two god warriors emerged. Both brothers had not only survived, but flourished. Nasus stood as a towering, jackal-headed avatar of wisdom and strength, while Renekton was a muscled behemoth in the likeness of a crocodile. Nasus had been gifted powers far beyond mortal understanding. The greatest boon of his ascension was the countless lifetimes he could now spend in study and contemplation, though this would also eventually become to be his greatest curse. But he was more immediately concerned by the increased savagery he saw within Renekton. At the siege of Nashrameh, finally bringing the city under Shuriman rule, Nasus learned that his brother had razed the Grand Library and massacred all who stood against him. This was the closest the brothers ever came to bloodshed, facing one another in the rubble, weapons drawn. Only under Nasus's stern, disappointed gaze did Renekton's bloodlust dwindle, and he turned away in shame. War with the rebel state of Acathia changed many of the Ascended. The horrors they witnessed left them hollow and quicker to anger. Nasus undertook centuries of solitary study as he tried to comprehend what had happened to his immortal brethren, and what it could mean for the future. When the ascension of Emperor Azir went terribly wrong, Nasus and Renekton were both far from the capital and returned with all haste, but they were too late. Over the bodies of countless Shuriman dead, they fought Zerath, that twisted, malevolent being of pure energy who had betrayed Azir, yet were unable to slay him. Filled with rage and perhaps seeking to atone for Nashrameh, Renekton wrestled Zerath into the tomb of the emperors beneath the city, bidding Nasus seal them in. Nasus refused, desperate to find another way, but there was none. With a heavy heart, he committed Zerath and his brother to the fathomless darkness for all eternity. Drained of its power by Zerath's sorcery, the sun disk fell, and every remaining god warrior felt its loss in their immortal heart. The divine waters flowing from the city's oasis ran dry, bringing death and famine to all Shurima. For a time, the other Ascended tried to hold the fractured empire together, before their countless rivalries led them to fight among themselves. Withdrawing entirely, Nasus bore a heavy burden of guilt, stalking the empty ruins that were slowly being swallowed by the desert, and lamenting everything that had been lost. Centuries passed, and Nasus all but forgot his former life and purpose, until the moment when the tomb of the emperors was rediscovered by mortals and its seal broken. He did not know how, but he knew Zerath was free. Ancient vigor reawakened in Nasus, and yet even he was stunned to see Azir reborn, and the sun disk raised once more from the sands. Though Zerath was still a grave threat, Nasus knew the God Emperor would have great need of guidance and counsel in the years ahead. And hope stirred within him, for the first time in millennia. Did he dare believe he might also be reunited with his beloved brother Renekton? And that's a sad final statement there in his biography, as we come to know that Renekton does not hold Nasus to the same beloved status anymore, as he has gone crazy due to the workings of Zerath, and is on the hunt or on a warpath to find Nasus and destroy him. And so we'll have to see if the lore ever gets continued. I know they do comics, but I don't think they really do those for this setting, these characters. And so we'll have to maybe imagine what would happen. I know there are other stories that are being written about this that we might read as we kind of wrap up Shurima in a few weeks. But until then, we don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sure if Nasus is going to recognize Renekton at all, or, well, I mean, he'd obviously recognize him physically, but I'm not sure what that first meeting is going to really be like when he realizes that Renekton is lost mentally. There is a quote from the game that Nasus says that might actually clue us into what he would say in his first encounter with Renekton after the Tomb of Emperors is unlocked. So let's listen to that.
Renekton was lost long ago. You are but his pale shadow.
So it seems he would understand what happened and know that the Renekton he knew is lost, never to come back, possibly, and knows that what's in front of him is not what he once knew. Moving forward from that, though, we do have our weekly story. This one is actually has the author's name on it, which is nice. Written by Ryan Vernier. It's called Ouroboros, Ourobboros. So here that is. Nasus walked at night, unwilling to face the sun. The boy followed in his wake. How long had he been there? Those mortals who caught a glimpse of the monstrous vagabond always ran, all save the boy. Together they wove a path through the bygone tapestry of Shurima. Self-imposed isolation chipped at Nasus's consciousness. The desert wind howled around their malnourished frames. Nasus, look above the dune sea, said the child. Stars guided the pair's sojourn across the desiccated expanse. The old jackal no longer wore the armor of the ascended. The golden monuments lay buried with the past. Now a hermit dressed in tattered fabric, Nasus scratched at his matted fur before slowly raising his head to observe the night sky. The piper, said Nasus, his voice low and gravelled. The season will change soon. Nasus put a hand on the boy's tiny shoulder and looked down into his sunburnt face. There he saw the soft lines and curves of Shurima's lineage, worn ragged by travel. When did it become your place to worry? Soon we will find you a home. Wandering between the ruins of an extinguished empire is no life for a child. This was the nature of the universe. Brief moments unfolded into the endless cycles of existence. The heady philosophy weighed upon him, but it was more than just another stone in his endless tally of self-imposed guilt. In truth, the boy would inevitably be changed if he was allowed to follow. Remorse darkened Nasus's brow like a thunderhead. Their companionship sated something deep within the ancient hero. We can reach Astrologer's Tower before dawn, but we'll have to climb, said the boy. The tower was close. Nasus pulled himself up the cliff, face hand over hand. The climb memorized to such perfection that he took great liberties with each handhold, tempting death. The boy clambered up by his side, his agile form utilizing every nook and cranny offered by the blemished rock. What would happen to this innocent if I gave in to death? The thought troubled Nasus. Wisps of fog rolled through the crags of the upper cliffs, each threading the narrow rocks like tiny mountain paths. The boy scurried over the top first. Nasus followed. In the distance, metal clanged against stone, and voices could be heard through the haze. They spoke in a familiar dialect. Nasus was shaken from his reverie. The well at Astrologer's Tower occasionally attracted nomads, but never this close to the equinox. The boy stood perfectly still, his fear palpable. "Where are the fires?" asked the boy. A horse's whinny pierced the night. "Who goes there?" asked the boy. The words rolled through the darkness. A lantern sparked to life, illuminating a band of riders, mercenaries, raiders. Jackal's eyes snapped wide. He saw 7 of them. Their curved blades remained sheathed, but the look in their eyes spoke of martial training and guile. "Where is the caretaker?" asked Nasus. "He and his wife are asleep. The cool evening prompted them to retire early," replied one of the riders. "Old Jackal, my name is Maloof," said another rider. "We have been sent by the Emperor." Nasus stepped forward, betraying the briefest hint of anger. "Does he seek acknowledgement? Then let me give it. There is no emperor in this fallen age," said Nasus. The boy stepped forward defiantly. The dark messengers backed away from the lantern. Long shadows obscured defensive stances. "Deliver your message and leave," said the child. Maloof dismounted and stepped forward. He reached a calloused hand into the folds of his shirt and produced a dark amulet bound to a thick black chain. The geometry of the metal sparked recollections of magic and destruction in Nasus's mind. "Emperor Zerath sends offerings. We are to be your servants. He welcomes you to his new capital at Narimazeth." The mercenary's words fell on Nasus like a hammer on glass. The boy promptly knelt and snatched up a weighty rock. "Die!" cried the boy. "Take him," said Maloof. With a heave, the boy hurled the rock through the air, its perfect arc threatening to shatter mercenary bone on impact. "Renekton, no!" roared Nasus. The riders abandoned their half-hearted deception. Nasus knew then that the caretaker and his wife were dead. Zerath's greeting would come in the form of cold steel. Truth began to eclipse illusion. Nasus reached for the boy. The child tore into shadows of memory that dissipated through the starlit ground. "Goodbye, brother," whispered Nasus. Zerath's emissaries fanned out, their horses bucking and snorting. The Ascended was flanked on 3 sides. Maloof did not hesitate, drawing his blade and piercing Nasus' side with it. Pain rippled through the ancient curator's body. The rider attempted to withdraw his weapon, but it wouldn't budge. A clawed hand gripped the blade, keeping it agonizingly buried within Ascended flesh. "You should have left me to my ghost," said Nasus. Nasus tore Maloof's sword from his hand, shattering fingers and tearing ligaments. The demigod pounced on his attacker. Maloof's body cracked under the jackal's enormous weight. Nasus leapt to the next rider, pulling him from his saddle. 2 strikes ruptured organs and stole the wind from his lungs. His broken form spun off into the sand, a ruined mass of agony. His horse reared and fled into the desert. "He's mad," said one of the riders. "Not any longer," said Nasus, approaching the mercenary leader. A strange fragrance filled the air. Dead flowers spinning on lavender-colored threads followed in his wake. Maloof twisted on the ground. The broken fingers of his right hand withered, skin sagging like wet parchment. The barrel of his chest caved in on itself like a rotting spine fruit. White-knuckled panic overtook the remaining mercenaries. They struggled to keep their mounts under control, if only to retreat. Maloof's body lay abandoned in the sand. Nasus turned east toward the ruins of Narimazeth. "Tell your emperor his cycle nears its end." And that is the end of that story, and I really like the last line there. "His cycle nears its end," which we heard Nasus utter at the beginning of the show, that the cycle of life and death continues. We will live, they will die, and this is that incarnate. His mission now is turning towards Zerath, who apparently has claimed that he is now emperor of the Shuriman lands. Nasus does not accept this. Obviously he wouldn't. And now Zerath apparently has several followers to do his bidding and to go and try and kill other Ascended hosts. It's one thing to have mercenaries and raiders like this come after Nasus, but if Zerath were to somehow wrangle Renekton under his wing instead of just being a mad kind of out there on his own type vigilante looking for Nasus, then that might be even more troublesome for Nasus. That there was a concerted effort on the behalf of Zerath and Renekton to bring him down. So that's kind of exciting to see that Nasus is now, he's not just kind of wandering the desert anymore, and now he knows that he has a purpose. And it was also sad, though, for him to call the boy Renekton. Just so used to breaking up the childhood fights that Renekton was getting into, and seeing this boy do what he did, even though it was probably inevitable that there was going to be a fight there, it's still kind of sad. But that being said, we can now jump into our comparisons for the week. And the first one, we actually have a historical one this week. And it really focuses on Nasus's strength as like a tactician and as a general. And he's the greatest general in the history of Shurima. And he is better at planning the battles than fighting them, right? And so you win a battle before it starts. You know, kind of just like people use that analogy or that saying for, you know, basketball games, football games, any kind of sporting event. It's, you know, you win in your preparation, basically. And so people in history that fit this, there's definitely generals that were much better at preparing and outsmarting their enemy beforehand, which gave them just greater advantages when the battle actually happened, and then that minimized their losses, minimized time, minimized every kind of detrimental thing that you could have. And so that's why they're known to be great generals. So, I mean, Napoleon definitely comes to mind, but Napoleon was just much different in the other aspects of his life than Nasus for me to actually do a full-on comparison between the two. But for people who need a larger name to associate with Nasus, Napoleon is definitely one. He was very, very good as a tactician. Always, for the most part, actually. He did have a few mistakes, but everybody does. The one that we're actually going to focus on, or say that is the actual historical comparison, is the ancient Chinese figure Sun Tzu, Suntzu, or I think some pronunciations are Sun Wu, Sun Tzu. There are a couple variations, but he is attributed with writing the book The Art of War, which is the most famous military book in history and has guided military planning and action for thousands of years. All of the great generals in history have probably read The Art of War, or some variation on it, or its concepts have been explained to them. And the book details when and how to attack your enemy. It also includes explanations and descriptions of things that go into warfare other than just the physical combat aspect. So Nasus is the Shuriman equivalent of Sun Tzu, essentially. And to give you a sense of what The Art of War is kind of about, it's split up into, I believe, 13 chapters. And so the first one is titled Laying Plans. And here's a brief kind of description of what the whole chapter is about. It would be exploring the 5 fundamental factors, which he lists as the way, seasons, terrain, leadership, and management, and 7 elements that determine the outcomes of military engagements. By thinking, assessing, and comparing these points, a commander can calculate his chances of victory. Habitual deviation from these calculations will ensure failure via proper and improper inaction. The text stresses that war is a very grave matter for the state and must not be commenced without due consideration. This is very on brand and on point for like what Nasus would be about when he's planning out military conquests, right? He's going to go through all of these steps to basically enter into a battle knowing that he's going to win it. Now with Shurima, they were dominant and they had ascended gods on their side. So it's kind of hard to lose battles like that. But this, he was also, as it says, very empathetic, and so wanted to take the appropriate measures to make sure that his soldiers weren't dying recklessly, that they were properly provisioned, and that they went in with as much knowledge as they could. Chapter 2, we're not going to go through all these, but just another one. It's called Waging War, and it explains how to understand the economy of warfare and how success requires winning decisive engagements quickly. This section advises that successful military campaigns require limiting the cost of competition and conflict. Again, just reiterating that Nasus was big on limiting the cost that Shurima bore to go to war and to win these battles. It was not something that he took lightly. He didn't like war. He understood why they were going to war, but he was going to do everything he could to make sure that as few people died. And then also Sun Tzu and Nasus are both high-ranking members of their respective societies, and they're both very well-educated people, and so that's just a kind of another way to connect the two, that they were more than just generals in the army. I mean, there's not much is known about Sun Tzu's life, and some speculate if he even existed, but the figure himself is very representative of a large aspect of Nasus's life, which is his role as a general in the Shuriman military. The other comparison that we're going to be diving into right now is from the TV show A Game of Thrones, which we had one a couple weeks ago with Theon and Zerath. But for Nasus, we are going to be comparing him to Tyrion Lannister, which the obvious discrepancy here is that Tyrion is a dwarf, whereas Nasus is this mighty, imposing, just massive figure of an ascended god being. So there's a very big difference there, physically speaking. But nobody in Game of Thrones is a jackal-headed, monster, more or less. But in regards to Tyrion Lannister and Nasus, they both prefer knowledge over warfare, but both, I think, realize the cause and effect of war in their respective universes and the benefits and costs to war. They understand the cost in funding a war, in paying soldiers, and provisions, and they understand the human life cost of it, and they understand that minimizing that is the key to winning the war. Tyrion is Hand of the King multiple times, just as Nasus is a very important advisor to the Emperor of Shurima, both Azir and his father before him. So Hand of the King is, in Game of Thrones, the like the vice president, but with a lot more power than what like a U.S. vice president would have. The Prime Minister of England, and then the king is the king, or in this case, the queen. They are the number two. They carry out all of the crown's wishes and decrees, and they also just kind of handle the day-to-day ruling of the kingdoms. So Tyrion is Hand of the King multiple times, and Nasus is this advisor, both militarily and probably policy-wise, to Shurima. And like I said, this comparison might be more different than it is alike due to their physical stature and kind of the way that they handle their personal lives, at least Tyrion for a large portion of the show, not as it progresses. But Tyrion, being a dwarf, is an outcast in his own family and kind of in society, whereas Nasus is loved and respected by everyone in Shurima and has this massive, imposing figure. Tyrion does flee his home and to live in exile after murdering his father. And Nasus, I guess, would similarly be living in a life of pseudo-exile or self-imposed exile in the desert sands of Shurima, just waiting to wither away after dooming his brother to an eternity locked away. So, I mean, there's definitely something that you could make a connection with there. If we stick with the Game of Thrones theme, though, you could make a mix between Tyrion and Lord Eddard Stark, who we did talk about when we talked about Theon. And this would make for a good combination to match kind of the character of Nasus. Lord Stark is a tall, strong man who towers over a lot of other people. Just because I think being from the north, they're just bigger up there. Just people think Texas is that way, even though it's not really. And he's the quote brother unquote of the king at the time, Robert Baratheon, when Lord Stark is alive and hand of the king. He's the hand to King Robert Baratheon, and they fought together and they grew up together when they were young, and Lord Eddard Stark helped Robert win the throne, and he picks him as his hand after another one passes away. And so Eddard's chosen as hand of the king and must be the mind of reason in opposition to Robert's more violent, warmongering, soldieristic style of ruling. And that brothership there is very much like the brothership of Nasus and Renekton. If we could give Tyrion's love of reading and use of that knowledge for good to Eddard, and Tyrion has a great quote that I will play for you right now that really would be indicative of the relationship between Nasus and Renekton, and it's a quote that Tyrion is using to explain a concept, and the quote is referencing both him and his brother, and so I guess that one is much more different than the one that we're using, but it's funny that the whole brother theme is so prevalent in a lot of different lores and stories.
My brother has his sword, and I have my mind, and the mind needs books like a sword needs a whetstone.
So, a mind needs books like a sword needs a whetstone. It's very, I don't know, I like that quote a lot, kind of playing on the whole jock versus nerd type trope that exists also. But yeah, that does it for those comparisons. I think I'm going to work on trying to make a bit longer ones that are a bit more detailed, but thank you everyone for listening. I know this is coming out late, but there were some technical difficulties with the recording software that is delaying it. Hopefully that's fixed entirely though. And we didn't really end this week with a lead-in to next week's episode or next week's character, which is a first. Actually, we've had one each week that helps us know what we're kind of getting into, but I'm probably going to do a character that's been mentioned multiple times, and that's the one who unseals the Tomb of the Emperors, or who we believe unseals the Tomb of the Emperors, which is Sivir, who is a long-lost descendant of Azir. I think it said somewhere that she did it. I think it says somewhere that it's her and Cassiopeia, and then other times it just says mortals or raiders. So maybe we'll get an answer to that. Maybe she didn't actually do it. But we can figure that out next week while we are going through her biography and her story. So again, thank you all for watching, or not watching. I guess you could be watching if you are listening to this on our YouTube channel, which is at Funky Odor on YouTube, or you can search for League Lore and More episodes. And then also we stream League of Legends content as well as other games, but we try to do mostly League of Legends content on twitch.tv/thatfunkyodor. Also, these links will all be in the description, so check those out, because there's other ones in there too for kind of more podcast centric links. And again, thank you to everyone, and I'll hopefully be on time next week with the episode, but we shall see. And I will see you guys all next week. So thanks for listening.